"Don't come for Christmas, Eleanor," my mother said gently over the phone. "We'll pretend we don't know you for this one evening," my younger brother Caleb added with a chilling casualness. Those words, spoken with a calm that cut deeper than any surgeon's knife, have remained etched in my mind for decades. They were the turning point of my entire life. Good morning to all of you who have chosen to spend a moment of your day with me. My name is Eleanor. I am 78 years old, and I am speaking to you from my home here in Richmond, Virginia, in this year 26. It is a world that feels so different from the one I grew up in, a world that moves faster and forgets the value of a person far too easily. Before we dive into this story of dignity, betrayal, and the strength that is born from silence, I would like to ask you to join this small community. If you enjoy sincere stories made of real life, and that justice which sometimes arrives when you least expect it, please leave a like on this video and subscribe to this channel. I would be very happy to know which part of the world or the country you are listening from and what kind of testimonies you prefer to hear, so please write it in the comments. Your company makes these memories feel even more alive and worthwhile. To understand what happened during that Christmas many years ago, I must explain who I was then and the life I had built for myself. I worked as a senior doctor in the geriatric ward of one of the largest hospitals here in Richmond. Many people, including my own family, defined my work as depressing or heavy because I chose to spend my days among people whom society preferred to forget. I spent my hours in the quiet, sterile hallways, listening to the final secrets of my patients, treating their fragile bodies with the respect they deserved, and often holding their hands as they breathed their last. For me, it was never depressing. It was a mission of dignity. It was a commitment that required everything from me: my energy, my patience, and an unwavering ability to remain steady in the face of human suffering. In those years, we handled our finances a bit differently. But to make everything clearer and more immediate for those listening today, I will use modern dollar values to describe the figures. I believe it helps to better perceive the scale of the sacrifices I was making for a family that eventually decided I wasn't worth the space at their holiday table. That evening, in late December, I had returned home after a grueling 14-hour shift at the hospital. I was drained, feeling the weight of the tiredness deep in my bones, but I was strangely serene as I prepared for the holidays. I looked at my travel bag, already packed and sitting near the entrance of my apartment, and I couldn't stop smiling. I had planned everything to perfection. I had bought thoughtful gifts for every member of my family, spending a large portion of my hard-earned salary to ensure everyone felt special. For my mother, Margaret, I had chosen an antique silver brooch that she had admired in a shop window months before. For Caleb, my younger brother, I had purchased a high-end camera kit, hoping it might finally inspire him toward a stable career. I had even bought all the fresh ingredients for the rosemary stuffing that had become a family requirement at dinner. I was always the one who cooked, cleaned, and organized every detail of our gatherings, even though no one ever seemed to notice the effort. I had also bought a new sweater for myself, a deep forest green wool. It was simple, festive, and soft. I just wanted to feel part of the group for once. I wanted to sit at that table and feel at home after a long year spent in the sterile corridors of the geriatric ward. As I was taking off my heavy coat, the landline began to ring. I immediately thought it was Caleb calling to coordinate my arrival or to ask me to pick up extra wine. Caleb had always been the favorite, the miracle child my parents called the golden boy. He was creative and sensitive, though I had learned long ago that his sensitivity only ever seemed to apply to his own needs. I, being the oldest, had always been the reliable one, the daughter who didn't cause problems, the one who could handle it all without complaining. When I answered the phone, Caleb's voice was unusually tense and lacked its usual charm. He told me he had met a girl named Abigail who came from a very prominent and wealthy family. He explained that Abigail was a very particular person, highly attentive to the vibrations and energies of people around her. He said she was in a very delicate phase of her life and that my presence, carrying the load of suffering from my work at the hospital, would be too heavy for her to handle. Caleb used that exact word, heavy. He said that for Abigail's sake, and to keep the holiday atmosphere light and cheerful, it would be better if I stayed home that year. He told me I reminded them too much of illness and the end of life, and that I simply didn't fit the image he wanted to project. He didn't care about the gifts I had bought or the fact that I had already organized the entire meal. He was simply telling me, as if he were talking to a stranger, that I was no longer wanted in my own family's home. I stood in absolute silence for a few long seconds, holding the receiver tight against my ear. I couldn't even find the words to respond to such a cold rejection. I didn't try to explain that my work was actually about life and dignity, not just death. I didn't tell him how much I needed my family after such a long year. I knew it would be useless to argue with his narcissism. About an hour later, it was my mother, Margaret, who called me. Her voice was soft, using that practiced maternal tone she always used to manipulate situations to her advantage. She told me we had to make things easy for Caleb because he was so happy with Abigail. She said they didn't want to cause any unnecessary tension or confusion at the dinner table. Then she uttered the sentence that changed everything for me. "Actually, Eleanor, if you were to show up, we might even decide not to answer the door. We'll pretend we don't know you this time, just so we don't have to give difficult explanations about your work to the girl." It was at that precise moment that something inside me broke definitively. It wasn't a feeling of hot anger or desperate sadness. It was a cold, lucid, and surgical awareness. I finally understood that I wasn't a daughter or a sister to them. I was just a function, a utility they could discard the moment I no longer served to fuel their image of social perfection. I hung up the phone without saying a single word of protest. I sat at my desk and opened the folder where I kept all my financial documents. I looked at the numbers and the automatic wire transfers that left my account every month like clockwork. For years, I had been the invisible backbone of their comfortable lives. I paid $800 every month into my mother's account to cover the mortgage on the house where they lived, a house she could never have afforded on her own after my father passed. I regularly paid the installments for Caleb's car, about $300 a month, because he could never hold down a job for more than a few weeks. Besides this, I had created a family emergency fund where I put another $200 monthly to handle repairs and taxes. All of this was done in absolute silence. I had never demanded a thank you or any recognition because I truly thought it was my duty to help those I loved. That evening, with a glacial calm, I picked up the phone and called my bank's customer service. One by one, I revoked all permanent wire transfers. I suspended the mortgage payment, canceled the car installment for my brother, and closed the emergency fund. I also blocked the prepaid card I had given Caleb for his small needs, which I knew often translated into expensive dinners and designer clothes that I would never have dreamed of buying for myself. I made no announcement and sent no messages. I simply stopped being their silent ATM. I knew they wouldn't notice the change immediately. When you are used to receiving help constantly, you end up taking it for granted as a natural right. They thought I was heavy, completely ignoring the fact that it was precisely that heavy work that allowed them to live with such effortless lightness. I took the bag I had packed to the storage room with a sense of finality. The gifts remained in their boxes. I decided that I would spend that Christmas alone, finally free from the crushing weight of trying to please people who didn't even see me. I spent Christmas Eve sitting on my sofa with a cup of tea and a book. It was strange at first, but then it became incredibly peaceful. There were no shouts from Caleb or complaints from my mother. There was only the silence of Richmond outside the window and the warmth of my own home. For the first time in many years, I didn't feel responsible for someone else's happiness. I felt light, despite Caleb's crude jokes about me being a doctor of death. While they were at the table, probably toasting Abigail and laughing at my absence, I was already writing a new chapter of my life. New Year's Day was approaching, and with it, the deadlines for the payments I had blocked. I knew that soon the phone would start ringing again, but this time, the rules of the entire game would be set by me. I was a doctor, after all. I knew how to recognize when a limb was gangrenous and had to be amputated to save the rest of the body. My family was that gangrene, and I had just started the surgical intervention necessary to finally breathe. Every time I came home and saw the red light of the answering machine flashing, I felt a small shock of satisfaction. I didn't listen to the messages. I already knew what I would find. First confusion, then annoyance, and finally a desperate, entitled anger. They were used to an Eleanor who never said no and who apologized for the mere fact of existing. They weren't at all ready for the Eleanor who had finally learned the value of her own no. Christmas passed in that bubble of voluntary isolation. I had cooked for myself and walked through the quiet streets, finally feeling like the mistress of my own time. I had spent years fearing their judgment, but now I understood that the only true selfishness had always been theirs. Dr. Eleanor was no longer at the service of the family's whims. I was finally at the service of my own dignity. On the morning of December 27th, I woke up with a strange feeling of expectation. I prepared my coffee calmly. The phone rang at exactly 9 o'clock. It was my mother's house number. I looked at it for a long moment, then took a deep breath and decided not to answer. I wasn't yet ready to hear their voices loaded with demands and false concern. I wanted them to taste the uncertainty a little longer. I wanted them to start to understand what it truly meant to be alone without my support to catch them, because they had never been alone. They had always had me standing behind them as a safety net. Now, for the first time in their lives, they were walking on a tightrope without any protective net under their feet. I looked at my reflection in the mirror. I no longer saw the tired and submissive woman who apologized for her heavy work. I saw a professional who was finally saving herself. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was my road. I knew that soon their crystal life would start showing the first cracks, and I was ready to watch it shatter. I understood that family is a pact of mutual respect that they had violated. They had excluded me from the party, and so I had excluded them from my wallet. It was a fair exchange. I spent the afternoon putting my things in order. I went for a long walk toward the city center. The Christmas lights still hanging in the streets didn't make me sad anymore. Returning home, I noticed that the light of my answering machine was still flashing, but I felt only a sort of clinical curiosity. I took off the forest green sweater that I hadn't had the courage to wear at Christmas. I was ready for whatever happened next. I was free from the necessity of being useful to be loved. The night fell on the city with a pungent cold, and I slipped under my covers, feeling the silence like a warm, protective embrace. The quiet of my Richmond apartment felt solid that morning, a stark change from the years of noisy demands and constant crises. I sat at my small kitchen table, the steam from my coffee rising in the gray winter light. For the first time in my memory, I didn't feel the sudden, anxious urge to check my messages or worry about a family disaster that only I could solve. My mind drifted back to the early days, right after my father passed away. I was just finishing my residency then, exhausted and full of grief. My mother, Margaret, was a woman of social committees and garden parties. She had no idea how to balance a checkbook or pay an electric bill. I took over the household finances, assuming it was my duty as the eldest child. I thought by handling the heavy things, the mortgage, the taxes, the insurance, I was letting them heal in peace. But healing turned into a lifelong entitlement for them, and my silence became the floor they walked on without a thought. Caleb was the gift my parents had late in life, the boy who could do no wrong. While I was pulling double shifts in the geriatric ward, coming home with the smell of disinfectant in my hair, Caleb was pursuing creative visions that never materialized into a paycheck. He wanted to be a painter, then a consultant for brands that didn't exist. Each dream came with a price tag that I was expected to cover. There was the art studio in an expensive part of downtown Richmond. Caleb insisted he needed high ceilings and specific light to create. I paid that rent for 3 long years, over $1,000 every month. He would talk for hours about the energy of his work, never once asking how many hours I spent on my feet in the hospital to pay for the floor he stood on. My mother only encouraged his delusions, telling me that artists were delicate souls who needed a soft environment. She saw no irony in calling her doctor daughter boring while living entirely off the fruits of my labor. Then there were the credit cards. I had given Caleb a card years ago, meant only for emergencies. Soon those emergencies started looking like designer jackets and expensive 5-course dinners. I saw the statements every month. Charges for $300 shoes and $500 bar tabs from nights he spent networking. Every time I brought up the cost, Margaret would sigh and tell me I was being too rigid. She said Caleb was building a life and that I should be happy he had social standing. I was the one building that standing, one mortgage payment at a time, yet I was treated like an outsider at their gatherings. The luxury car was the final straw. Caleb had insisted he could not arrive at his meetings in an old sedan. He said he wouldn't be taken seriously. I agreed to the $300 monthly installments, thinking it would finally help him find stability. Instead, he used it to drive to parties while I took the bus when my own car was in the shop. I had become so used to the exploitation that I had stopped seeing it for what it was. The phone rang at 10 o'clock, sharp. I let it go to the machine. Margaret's voice was confused. "Eleanor, the bank just called. They said the mortgage payment was canceled. Please fix this computer error right away, dear. It's so embarrassing." She couldn't even conceive of me doing it intentionally. To her, I was an extension of the bank itself. I remembered calling the bank manager, a man I'd known for years, to stop the payment. He'd sounded surprised. "Are you sure, Dr. Eleanor? This has been a standing order for a decade." I had never been surer of anything. An hour later, Caleb called, his voice booming with indignation. "My card was declined at the coffee shop in front of Abigail. This is beyond embarrassing, Eleanor. You need to sort this out immediately. I have a reputation to maintain." He sounded as if I had stolen something from his own pocket. Not a single word was said about the fact that they had uninvited me from Christmas dinner. Not a single apology for the words they had used to push me away. I spent the afternoon at the hospital, where the atmosphere was much more honest. The geriatric ward was quiet, filled with the soft sounds of monitors. These people understood the true weight of life. One patient, a former carpenter named George who had worked with his hands for 50 years, took my hand as I was checking his vitals. "You look different today, Doc," he said with a weak but genuine smile. "Usually, you look like you're carrying the whole world, and the world is winning. Today, you look like you've put it down." I told him I'd finally decided to retire from a job I didn't even like, playing the role of the family safety net. He chuckled, a dry sound that ended in a cough. "Good for you. Life's too short to be a bridge for people who don't want to walk across it." He was right. I had been carrying a world of expectations that wasn't mine to bear. I had spent my life as a pillar for a house built on sand. When I returned home, the answering machine was full. Margaret's tone had shifted to anxiety. "People are calling the house, Eleanor. The car dealership called about an overdue balance. My heart can't handle this kind of stress. You know what the doctor said about my blood pressure. Just pay the bills and we can talk later." It was the same old tactic, using her health to manipulate me. Caleb's messages were full of threats. "If you don't turn the card back on, I'm coming over. We're family, Eleanor. You have a responsibility to us. You can't just quit on us." The irony was almost funny. He had never taken responsibility for a single bill in his life. Their rage was the sound of the parasite losing its host. The New Year's party at the country club was coming up. Caleb had been bragging for months about introducing Abigail to Richmond's elite. He was counting on me to pay for the tickets and the tuxedo he had needed. Those tickets were $500 each, a steep price for a night of hollow social climbing. I knew those tickets hadn't been purchased because I'd received a notification that the payment was declined. He would have to explain his social failure to Abigail. I felt a small flicker of guilt, but I pushed it aside. This was the result of his choices. He had chosen to treat his sister like a servant, and now he would have to live with the consequences. The next day, the 1st of January, reality hit them hard. Margaret called 10 times before noon. I didn't answer. I went to the hospital, focusing on my patients who actually needed me. I saw the message slips on my desk at the hospital. Call your mother. Urgent. Mortgage. Caleb's studio. I took them one by one and fed them into the shredder. The hum of the machine was the most satisfying sound I'd heard all year. I wasn't being cruel, I was being firm. Caleb's art studio was the first real casualty. He called later that evening, voice cracking with desperation. He told me the landlord had served an eviction notice because the rent check hadn't cleared. Eleanor, please, my work is in there. My whole life is in that studio. Just this one last time. I thought of all the nights I had eaten dinner from a hospital vending machine to pay for that empty space where he spent his days talking about vibrations. I realized I didn't care about his paintings or his creative consultant projects. You have hands, Caleb, I whispered to the empty office. You can move your own paintings. I'm done. The peace I felt was becoming a fortress. I started taking long walks in the park, enjoying the pale winter sun without the nagging feeling that I should be solving someone else's problem. I was no longer defined by what I could do for my mother or my brother. I was just Eleanor. Aunt Brenda called on the evening of the 2nd. She was the only one in the family who didn't sound like she wanted something from me. I hear you've caused quite a stir, she said with a chuckle. Margaret is in a state of shock, and Caleb looks like a ghost. They're telling everyone you've gone on strike. I laughed, a genuine laugh. I'm not on strike, Brenda. I'm just retired from being their bank. Brenda laughed with me. It's about time, Eleanor. They'll try everything to get you back in line, believe me. They don't know how to survive without you. Stay strong. I spent New Year's Eve by my fireplace, watching the red embers. I didn't go to any parties. I just sat in the quiet and enjoyed the absence of drama. I didn't toast to the new year with champagne. I toasted to myself with a simple cup of tea. To the woman who finally found the courage to say no after 40 years. As the clock struck midnight, I felt a sense of excitement I hadn't felt in years. I was 78, and my life was finally my own. I would no longer be the invisible pillar holding up a house of lies. I looked in the mirror and didn't see a woman of death. I saw a woman with a voice and a soul no longer for sale. I put on my forest green sweater, the wool soft and warm. It was the first thing I had bought for myself in years without worrying about the price tag or if Caleb needed the money for something else. I was Eleanor, a doctor, a woman of value, and I was finally free. The weight of their expectations was gone, replaced by the strength of my own resolve. I realized that for 40 years I had been holding my breath, waiting for them to love me for who I was instead of what I did. Now, I could finally breathe. My family's world was built on my exhaustion, and without it, their crystal life was shattering. As the 2nd of January dawned, a thin layer of frost covered the city, making everything look clean and new. I made my breakfast in the quiet kitchen, listening to the birds. No more panicked messages for at least a few hours. They were likely scrambling now, trying to find another way to fund their illusions. But the bank was closed to them, and the credit was gone. I felt a deep, satisfying peace in my bones. I was no longer the servant of their vanity. I was a professional who had given her life to others, and was now taking it back for herself. My story wasn't ending. It was just beginning a new, honest chapter. The invisible pillar was gone, and I was looking forward to seeing what would happen when they finally realized I was never coming back to save them from themselves. The realization of my freedom didn't come all at once, but in small waves throughout the day. When I went to the grocery store and didn't have to worry about Caleb's overdrawn account. When I planned my weekend without checking if Margaret needed a ride. Every moment was a small victory. I sat on my balcony in the afternoon, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The winter air was crisp and fresh. I thought about the rosemary stuffing I didn't have to make for people who wouldn't thank me. I had cooked a small, perfect meal for myself instead. It was delicious. I was Eleanor, and I was finally at home in my own heart. The weight of the silence was gone, and in its place was the quiet strength of a woman who had finally learned her own worth. I felt a sense of purpose that was entirely my own. I wasn't working to pay off Caleb's bad decisions or Margaret's social debts. I was working because I loved medicine and because I cared about my patients. This clarity changed the way I moved through the wards. I was more patient and more attentive. My colleagues noticed the change. "You seem different, Eleanor," my head nurse said. "Lighter, somehow." I just smiled and told her I had finally taken a much-needed vacation from things that weren't my business. I was no longer carrying the world, I was just living in it. And that was more than enough for me. The future was unwritten, and for the first time, I was the one holding the pen. I felt lighter than I had in decades, ready to face the world on my own terms. My journey toward self-discovery was just beginning, and I welcomed the challenges and joys that lay ahead with an open heart and a renewed sense of dignity. I was no longer the invisible bridge. I was the traveler, and the road was mine to choose. The transition from the old life to the new one was marked by a series of quiet ripples. In Richmond, the first few days of January carry a particular chill, a damp cold that rolls off the James River. I spent those days in a focused calm, moving between my apartment and the hospital with a sense of purpose. My decision to stop the financial support for my mother and Caleb was a surgical necessity, a clean cut meant to save my own soul from further erosion. I had spent 40 years justifying and pleading for respect. Now, the empty bank accounts were doing the talking for me. At the hospital, the geriatric ward was particularly busy. I welcomed the work. In the ward, I was Dr. Eleanor, a woman whose worth was measured by her clinical judgment and her ability to comfort the suffering. I wasn't the boring daughter or the heavy presence. I was the one people looked to when they were at their most vulnerable. It was a stark contrast to the way my mother and brother viewed my life. To them, my career was a source of income and a social inconvenience. One morning, my head nurse, Sarah, noticed the change. "You're staying late again, Eleanor," she said. "And you didn't check your messages during lunch. That's a first." I smiled. "I'm on a permanent vacation from other people's problems, Sarah." Back at my apartment, the silence was becoming a beautiful thing. I would come home after a 12-hour shift, make a simple dinner, and sit in my armchair with a book. I didn't check the answering machine until I was emotionally ready. The little red light would be blinking furiously, a beacon of the chaos I had left behind. When I finally chose to listen, the messages were a timeline of desperation. It started with confusion on the 1st of January. Margaret's voice was high-pitched. "Eleanor, I don't understand. The bank says the mortgage check didn't clear. Call the branch manager immediately." By the 2nd of January, her tone had turned to a sharp anger. "This is beyond a joke, Eleanor. People are talking. I had to tell the girls at the garden club that there was a technical glitch. You are making me look like a fool in front of my peers." Caleb's messages were even more volatile. He had lived in a world where money simply appeared. "The car dealership called, Eleanor. They're talking about repossession. Do you have any idea how that looks? I was supposed to take Abigail out tonight. You need to fix this right now." He didn't ask if I was okay. He didn't mention the words he had said to me before Christmas. He only cared about the luxury car and the image he was trying to project. It was a perfect illustration of why I had made my choice. Their world was a house of cards, and I was the one who had been holding it up against the wind for far too long. The grand New Year's Eve party at the country club had passed, and I knew it had been a disaster for Caleb. Abigail's family expected a certain level of decorum. Caleb had shown up without the tickets he thought I would buy, and the humiliation of being turned away at the door had been total. Caleb had tried to claim there was a mistake with the VIP list, but Abigail had seen right through it. She was observant. She had noticed the way Caleb talked about me, the heavy sister, and she had begun to put the pieces together. While Caleb was dealing with his social death, I was dealing with the real thing at the hospital. On the 3rd of January, one of my favorite patients, Clara, began to fade. I spent hours at her bedside. She had no family left, no one to hold her hand. I sat with her in the dim light of the ward, listening to her shallow breathing and thinking about the value of a life. Clara had nothing in the way of social standing. She had her memories and the impact she had made as a teacher. In that quiet room, the drama of my mother's mortgage and Caleb's car felt like static from a distant radio station. When Clara finally passed, it was peaceful. I felt a deep sense of privilege to have been there for her. When I returned home that night, I saw Caleb's car parked outside. He was sitting on the hood, looking like a ghost in the cold air. Caleb stood up, his face twisted in rage. "You finally decided to show up," he spat. "Do you have any idea what you've done? Abigail won't take my calls. My landlord locked the studio today. My life is over because of your little tantrum." I looked at him and saw a middle-aged man who had never grown up. "It wasn't a tantrum, Caleb," I said steadily. "It was a retirement. I'm retired from being your bank. I'm retired from being the sister you hide because I remind you of reality. If your life is over because I stopped paying your bills, then you never really had a life. You had a fantasy funded by my exhaustion." He moved toward me, but he stopped when he saw the look in my eyes. I wasn't afraid of him. I had seen too much real suffering to be intimidated by a man whose biggest problem was a repossessed car. "You're heartless," he hissed. "Mother is right. The hospital has turned you into a monster. You don't care about your own family." I smiled. "I care about the truth, Caleb, and the truth is that you and Mother have been parasites. You enjoyed the host as long as the blood was flowing, but now the host is gone. You'll have to find a way to feed yourselves." I walked past him and into the building. I heard him screaming insults, but the words didn't reach me. I was already in the elevator. The next day, Margaret showed up at the hospital. She waited in the lobby, knowing I would be embarrassed to make a scene. She was wearing her best coat and pearls, but her eyes were frantic. "Eleanor, we need to talk," she said, her voice trembling. "The bank sent a formal notice. If the mortgage isn't paid, they're starting the foreclosure process. You can't let them take the family home. Your father would be ashamed of you." I led her to a quiet corner. Father would be ashamed of a son who doesn't work and a wife who expects her daughter to work until she drops to fund a lifestyle they can't afford, I said firmly. Margaret looked at me as if I had hit her. "How can you be so cruel? I'm your mother. I gave you life." I nodded slowly. "You did, and I've spent 40 years paying you back. But the debt is settled, Mother. The house is yours. If you can't pay the mortgage, you'll have to sell it. Caleb can get a job. He's healthy." Margaret scoffed. "A job? Doing what? He's an artist, Eleanor." I replied, "Then he's not meant for a luxury car or a studio in the city. You both made your choices. You chose to exclude me from Christmas because I was heavy. You chose to treat me like a servant. Now you have to live with those choices." I stood up and walked away, leaving her there. I felt a pang of sadness, but it was for the mother I wished I had, not the one trying to manipulate me. By the end of the week, the social circles of Richmond were buzzing. Word had gotten out that Caleb was in financial trouble. Without my money, his reputation vanished. Aunt Brenda called me on Friday evening. "Margaret is telling everyone you've had a nervous breakdown," she said. "She's trying to get you declared incompetent so she can take control of your accounts. She's talking to a lawyer." I wasn't surprised. Let her try, Brenda. I'm a senior doctor with impeccable records. If she wants a fight in court, I'll give her one, but she'll lose more than the house. She'll lose whatever shred of dignity she has left. I spent the weekend preparing my defense. I documented every transfer I had made. I was building a case for my independence. One evening, Abigail reached out to me. We met at a small coffee shop. Abigail looked tired but sharp. "I wanted to apologize," she said. "I didn't know the truth. Caleb told me you were difficult and obsessed with your work. He never told me you were the one supporting them." I looked at her. "You don't have to apologize. Caleb is good at creating a reality that suits him." She nodded. I realized something was wrong at that party. When he started making excuses about the tickets, I saw the truth. And then I remembered you at the hospital with my grandfather. You weren't heavy. You were the only thing holding us all together. I felt a lump in my throat. It was the first time someone saw the value of my presence without it being tied to a check. "I left him," Abigail continued. "I can't be with someone who treats his own sister like that. And I told my father everything. He knows who you are, Dr. Eleanor. This city knows who you are. He won't let your mother's lawyer friend do anything to you." I thanked her, feeling a wave of relief. The social fortress my mother built was crumbling. Abigail had become my strongest ally. It was the kind of justice you can't plan. As Abigail left, I sat in the shop for a long time. The world felt quiet and clean. I knew the struggle wasn't over. The foreclosure was still happening, but the power dynamic had shifted forever. I was no longer the invisible pillar. I was a woman respected for her own work. I began to look into moving. I wanted a fresh start in a place that was truly mine. I looked at some small cottages on the outskirts of Richmond, places with gardens where I could sit in the sun. It was an exciting prospect. I was 78, and for the first time, I was looking forward to the future without fear. The silence of the accounts continued to do its work. I heard from Brenda that Caleb had finally taken a job as a clerk. It was a blow to his ego, but it was a start. My mother was putting the house on the market. She was still complaining, but people were starting to pull away. The truth about their dependence on me had become common knowledge. As the month of January ended, I found myself sitting on a bench in the park, watching the sunset. I had lost a family, but I had found myself. That was the greatest gift. I was Dr. Eleanor, and I was finally at peace. The weight of the silence was gone, and in its place was the strength of my own voice. I was no longer the invisible pillar. I was the architect of my own life, and the view from here was magnificent. I went back to my apartment and saw the red light on the answering machine. I didn't listen to the messages. They didn't matter anymore. I picked up my book, wrapped myself in a blanket, and enjoyed the silence of my own home. I realized that my life had been so crowded with their needs that I hadn't known what I liked. I discovered I liked the quiet of the mornings. I was finally standing in my own truth. I found a small house in the countryside, not far from the city, and I knew the moment I saw it that it was the one. It was exactly what I needed. I signed the papers for the house with a hand that didn't shake. The lawyer congratulated me. "It's a beautiful spot, Doctor. You deserve some peace." I thanked her and realized that she was right. I did deserve it. I had spent my life caring for others, and it was finally time to care for myself. I was stripping away the layers of my old life, preparing for the new one. In my final days at the apartment, I had one last call from Aunt Brenda. She told me that Margaret had moved into a small apartment. Caleb was still working at the retail store, bitter and complaining. I listened to the news with a strange sense of detachment. I didn't wish them ill, but I no longer felt the need to save them. They were finally experiencing the consequences of their own actions. I told Brenda about my new house, and she promised to come visit once I was settled. "You're doing the right thing, Eleanor," she said. "Don't ever look back." And I knew she was right. I wouldn't look back. I had a whole new life ahead of me, and for the first time, I was the one holding the pen. The weight of the silence was gone, replaced by the beautiful, quiet strength of my own life. I was Eleanor, and I was finally free to be exactly who I was meant to be. I was at peace. The frost on the windows of my Richmond apartment seemed to thicken as the final hours of the year approached. I spent the morning of December 31st moving the first set of boxes into my car. It was a rhythmic, quiet process that felt more like a cleansing than a chore. Each box represented a piece of the life I was leaving behind. I didn't feel the sadness I expected. Instead, I felt a strange, light energy, as if I were finally shedding a skin that had become too tight. As I drove through the streets, I saw the preparations for the various New Year's Eve celebrations. The city was alive with anticipation, but for the first time, I wasn't part of the social theater. I was just Eleanor, a woman with a plan and a quiet heart. I spent my afternoon shift at the hospital, where the atmosphere was surprisingly calm. My patients were mostly resting, their rooms filled with the soft glow of winter light. I sat with Mrs. Gable for a while, an 85-year-old woman who had been a nurse during the war. She held my hand with a strength that always surprised me. "You have a journey ahead of you, Eleanor," she whispered. "I can see it in the way you walk today. Don't look back. The past is a heavy anchor, and you were born to sail." I thanked her, feeling a lump in my throat. It was remarkable how the people I cared for at the hospital saw me more clearly than the people who shared my DNA. While I was tending to my duties, the social world I had funded was preparing for its biggest night. The New Year's Eve gala at the Richmond Country Club was the pinnacle of the social calendar for families like mine. My mother, Margaret, had been talking about this night since the previous summer. It was supposed to be Caleb's grand debut with Abigail, a night that would solidify his place among the city's elite. I knew from the messages on my machine that things were falling apart for them, but I didn't know exactly how Caleb intended to save face. I found out later that evening through a frantic series of calls from Aunt Brenda, who was attending the event. Apparently, Caleb had managed to secure tickets at the last minute by promising a local businessman a creative consultation he could never deliver. He and Margaret had arrived at the club looking every bit the part of the successful family. They were dressed in clothes I had likely paid for months ago, smiling and nodding to people they had known for years. Abigail was there too, looking poised, though Brenda noticed that she seemed distant from Caleb. The tension between them was a thin wire ready to snap, and the gala provided the perfect stage for the final break. The country club had set up a commemorative display in the main ballroom to honor local professionals who had made significant contributions to the community. My hospital had submitted a few photographs, and one of them was a candid shot of me in the geriatric ward. In the photo, I was sitting on the edge of a bed, leaning in to listen to a patient. I wasn't wearing makeup or a designer gown. I was in my blue scrubs, my face tired but focused, my hand resting gently on the patient's arm. It was a photo of the heavy work Caleb and Margaret had found so embarrassing. Brenda told me that Abigail noticed the photo almost as soon as they entered the ballroom. She stopped in front of it, her expression shifting to profound recognition. She turned to Caleb and Margaret and asked, "Isn't this Eleanor? Your sister?" Brenda was standing nearby, listening to every word. Caleb's response was swift and dismissive. He didn't even look at the photo for more than a second. "Yes, that's her," he said with a sigh of exaggerated patience. "She's always been obsessed with that hospital. It's quite sad, really. She has no life outside of those depressing wards. She brings that energy home with her, which is why we had to ask her to stay away this year. We wanted to keep the holiday spirit light, you understand? My mother chimed in, her voice full of false sympathy. Eleanor is a good girl, Abigail, but she doesn't know how to leave the darkness of her work at the door. It's a burden for the family to constantly be reminded of death and illness. We try to encourage her to find more refined interests, but she's quite stubborn. She simply doesn't fit in at events like this. Brenda said the air around Abigail seemed to turn to ice. Abigail didn't move. She just stared at the photo of me, her eyes filling with anger and realization. Abigail finally turned to look Caleb directly in the eye. Her voice was quiet, but in the hush of the ballroom, it carried. "You have no idea who this woman is, do you?" Caleb laughed, a nervous sound. "What do you mean? I know her better than anyone." Abigail shook her head slowly. "No, Caleb, you don't know her at all. 3 years ago, my grandfather was in that hospital. He was dying, and the doctors told us there was nothing more they could do. He was terrified. But this woman, this heavy person you're so ashamed of, stayed with him every night. She wasn't even his primary doctor, but she sat with him. She held his hand when he couldn't breathe. She talked to me in the hallway for hours when I was falling apart." The guests nearby began to stop their conversations, drawn by Abigail's words. Caleb tried to reach for her arm. "Abigail, honey, you're making a scene. Let's go get a drink." Abigail pulled back, her eyes flashing. "Don't touch me. You told me your sister was difficult and resentful. You told me she was the one who didn't want to be around the family. But now I see the truth. You're ashamed of her because she's real and you're a ghost. You're ashamed of her because her work actually matters while you spend your life trying to look like someone you aren't with money you didn't earn." Abigail then turned to my mother, who was clutching her pearls in shock. "And you, Margaret? You're her mother. How could you stand by and let him talk about her like that? How could you exclude the very person who brings dignity to this family?" Margaret tried to speak, but no words came. Abigail didn't wait for a response. She looked at the guests who were now watching with attention. "Caleb told me he was a successful creative director. But I know now that he hasn't paid a bill in years. My father looked into your finances, Caleb. He wanted to make sure I was with someone stable. He found out that Eleanor pays for everything, the house, the car, even the tuxedo you're wearing right now." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the social execution my brother had feared his entire life. The elite of Richmond were now looking at him with a mixture of pity and disgust. Caleb was no longer the golden boy. He was a parasite who had been exposed. Abigail took off her corsage and placed it on the table. "I'm done, Caleb. I don't ever want to see you again, and I'm going to make sure everyone in this room knows exactly who Eleanor is. She's the only person in your family worth knowing." With that, Abigail walked out, leaving Caleb and Margaret alone in the center of judgment. Brenda said that Caleb tried to follow her, but the looks from the other guests stopped him. He turned to my mother, his face a mask of fury. "This is her fault," he hissed. "She did this on purpose. She stopped the money to humiliate us." But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. I hadn't done anything but stop participating in the lie. The truth had done the rest. I received Brenda's call around midnight as the fireworks were starting over the city. I was sitting on my balcony, watching the bursts of color. Brenda recounted the entire scene with grim satisfaction. "You should have seen his face, Eleanor. He looked like he wanted to vanish. And Margaret. She just kept saying there must be a mistake. It was pathetic." I listened, feeling a strange sense of closure. The heavy energy they had tried to avoid had finally arrived, but it hadn't come from my scrubs. It had come from their own lack of integrity. The aftermath of the gala was swift. By the next morning, the story of Caleb's humiliation had spread through every social circle. The prestige he had worked so hard to build was gone. People who had once invited him to every party suddenly found their guest lists were full. The gallery that had been considering his creative consultation officially withdrew their offer. Caleb's reputation had shattered. He was no longer the rising star, he was the man who had been publicly dumped for being a fraud. My mother felt the weight of the fallout. Her friends at the garden club were suddenly very busy when she called. The respectable Margaret was now the woman who had let her son mock her doctor daughter. The facade was gone, and without it, she had nothing but an empty house she couldn't afford, and a son who was a social pariah. I knew they would eventually come to me, out of a desperate need to fix their broken world. They still believed I was the only one who could save them. The first days of January were a blur. I finished packing and signed the final papers for my house in the countryside. The transition felt so right. I was moving away from the noise and the lies. I worked my shifts at the hospital with a renewed sense of purpose. The staff had heard rumors about the gala, and the respect I saw in their eyes was different. It was the kind of respect you give to someone who has finally found their footing. One evening, I found a letter waiting for me. It was from Abigail. She apologized again for the way her presence had been used to exclude me. She told me she had visited her grandfather's grave. "I think he would have been proud of me for standing up for you, Eleanor," she wrote. "You gave him peace in his final days. If you ever need anything, please don't hesitate to ask." I held the letter, feeling a warmth that no forest green sweater could ever provide. I had lost my biological family, but I was finding a new one, built on shared values. The silence of my apartment was no longer a burden. It was a sanctuary. I realized that for years I had been afraid of the silence because I thought it meant I was alone. But now I knew that being alone was not the same as being lonely. I was finally in my own company. I was Eleanor, the doctor, the woman who had said no, the woman who was finally free. I looked at the boxes stacked by the door, ready to be moved the next morning. I was ready for the next chapter. The weight of the silence was gone, and in its place was the steady, quiet hum of my own strength. The new year had brought a cold, clear light that illuminated everything. Caleb and Margaret were no longer the giants they had seemed. They were just people, flawed and lost in their own illusions. I didn't hate them. I just didn't want to be part of their story anymore. I had written my own ending, and it was an ending of dignity. As I closed my eyes, I felt a deep sense of peace. The surgery was over, the wound was healing, and I was finally going home. My home wasn't just a building, it was the space I had reclaimed within myself. I knew the next day would bring the final confrontation. I knew they would find out where I was moving, and they would come to me with their tears. But I was ready. I had my boundaries and my silence. They could scream all they wanted, but they couldn't touch the peace I had found. I was no longer the invisible pillar. I was the architect of my own destiny. The future was mine to shape, and for the first time in my 78 years, I couldn't wait to see what it held. The weight of the silence had become the wings of my freedom. I was finally free. I realized that my life had been like a long shift at the hospital, tiring, heavy, and often filled with other people's pain. But the shift was over now. I was heading out into the fresh winter air, leaving the sterile hallways behind. I thought of Abigail and Brenda and all the people who actually saw me. I realized that I didn't need a crowded dinner table to be happy. I just needed to be able to look in the mirror and like the woman staring back at me. And I did. I liked her very much. I was ready to walk into my new house and my new life without a single regret. The story of the woman who was too heavy to sit at the table was ending, and the story of the woman who built her own table was just beginning. It was a good, fair, and true ending. I realized that my life had been like a long shift at the hospital, tiring, heavy, and often filled with other people's pain. But the shift was over now. I was heading out into the fresh winter air, leaving the sterile hallways behind. I thought of Abigail and Brenda and all the people who actually saw me. I realized that I didn't need a crowded dinner table to be happy. I just needed to be able to look in the mirror and like the woman staring back at me. And I did. I liked her very much. I was ready to walk into my new house and my new life without a single regret. The story of the woman who was too heavy to sit at the table was ending, and the story of the woman who built her own table was just beginning. It was a good, fair, and true ending. Settling into my new cottage on the outskirts of Richmond was a quiet revelation. The house was a small, sturdy structure with wide windows that looked out over a cluster of ancient oak trees. On that first morning in my new home, the air was crisp, and the world was covered in a thin, shimmering layer of frost. I made a pot of coffee and sat on the porch, wrapped in a thick wool blanket. The silence here wasn't the heavy, expectant silence of my old apartment, where I was always waiting for the phone to ring with some new disaster. This silence was light. It was full of the sounds of the woods, the rustle of dry leaves, the distant call of a bird, the wind moving through the branches. For the first time in nearly 40 years, I felt completely at peace. I spent the first few days arranging my books and placing the few meaningful mementos I had kept. I didn't miss the expensive furniture or the social pressure of my old neighborhood. I had everything I needed right here. My medical journals occupied the shelves in my small study, a reminder of the career I had built with my own hands. I felt a sense of ownership over my space and my time that was entirely new. I went to the hospital for my shifts, and for the first time, the work didn't feel like a burden I was carrying back to a hostile home. It felt like a service I was proud to provide. The respect from my colleagues had deepened after the news of the country club gala had finished making its rounds. They didn't see me as a victim. They saw me as a woman who had finally stood her ground. However, I knew that the peace was a fragile thing. I knew that my mother and Caleb would eventually find me. They weren't the kind of people to let a source of income go without a fight. The confrontation came on a Tuesday evening, just as the sun was beginning to set, casting long orange shadows across the grass. I saw their car pull into the driveway, the luxury sedan that was now dusty and neglected, a visual metaphor for their crumbling lifestyle. I didn't feel the sudden jolt of panic I used to feel. I just took a slow, deep breath and walked to the door. I didn't open it immediately. I watched them through the glass for a moment. They looked different. My mother was huddled in her coat, her expression a mix of desperation and rehearsed grief. Caleb looked haggard, the arrogant smirk replaced by a sullen, tired frown. When I finally opened the door, I didn't invite them in. I stood in the doorway, a physical boundary between my new life and their old demands. "Eleanor, thank God we found you," my mother began, her voice trembling with a practiced fragility. "We've been so worried. Why didn't you tell us you were moving? We had to practically bribe your old landlord to get the forwarding address." I didn't answer. I just looked at her, waiting for the real reason they were there. Caleb pushed forward, his voice loud and aggressive, a mask for his obvious fear. "Look, Eleanor, this has gone far enough. The bank is foreclosing on the house. My car is being repossessed tomorrow. You've had your little moment of revenge, but people are actually suffering now. You need to come back and fix this. We're family." "I didn't do this for revenge, Caleb," I said, my voice calm and steady. "I did it for my own survival. And you aren't suffering. You're just experiencing the reality of the life you chose. You chose to live beyond your means. You chose to treat me like a servant while I paid for your clothes and your projects. Now, you have to choose how to deal with the consequences." My mother reached out to touch my arm, but I stepped back. "Eleanor, honey, please. We were wrong about Christmas. We were just stressed. It was a misunderstanding. We love you. You're the heart of this family." I felt a flash of pity for her, but it was quickly replaced by a cold clarity. "The heart of the family doesn't get told to stay away, so she doesn't ruin the energy of a dinner party, Mother." The heart of the family isn't treated like a social embarrassment. I wasn't the heart of this family, I was the bank, and the bank is closed. Caleb's face twisted in rage. You heartless bitch! You're going to let your own mother lose her home after everything she did for you? You think you're so much better than us because you spend your days with dying people? I looked him directly in the eye. No, Caleb, I don't think I'm better than you. I just think I'm done with you. My work isn't heavy because it's about death. It's heavy because it's real, and that's something you've never been able to handle. I pulled Abigail's letter from the pocket of my sweater and held it out. Abigail sent this to me. She told me everything that happened at the gala. She told me how you ridiculed me in front of everyone. She told me how you tried to hide the fact that I was the one paying for your life. You didn't just exclude me from Christmas. You tried to erase my existence while living off my labor. There is no misunderstanding here. There is only the truth. Caleb snatched the letter, his hands shaking as he scanned the lines. He didn't have a comeback. The evidence of his own betrayal was right there in his hands, written by the woman he had been so desperate to impress. You're not coming inside, I said, my voice final. And you're not getting another cent from me. Mother, you have enough equity in that house to buy a small condo if you sell it now. Caleb, you have hands and a brain. You can find a job like everyone else. I'm not your safety net anymore. I'm just a woman living her life. My mother started to cry. Real tears this time, born of the realization that her power over me was truly gone. But what are we going to do, Eleanor? We don't know how to live like this. I smiled sadly. You'll learn. Just like I learned how to live without your approval. Goodbye, Mother. Goodbye, Caleb. I closed the door and locked it. I heard Caleb shouting insults and kicking the porch railing, but the sounds felt far away, as if they were coming from another world entirely. I walked back into my kitchen and finished my coffee. The sunset had faded into a deep, velvety purple, and the first stars were beginning to appear over the trees. I felt a profound sense of relief, as if a great weight had finally been lifted from my shoulders. The confrontation was over. The surgery was complete. I was finally, truly free. I spent the rest of the evening reading by the fire, the quiet of the cottage, a sanctuary I had earned through decades of sacrifice. I realized that my dignity wasn't something they could take from me, it was something I had to reclaim for myself, and I had done it. Over the next few months, the ripples of my decision continued to settle. My mother did sell the house. She moved into a small, manageable apartment in a quieter part of the city. She stopped going to the expensive garden club meetings and started spending more time with Aunt Brenda, who didn't tolerate her manipulations. Caleb lost the luxury car and the studio. He took a job working in the stockroom of a local department store. It was a massive blow to his ego, but it was honest work. I didn't see them often, but when I did, the dynamic had changed. I was no longer the one seeking their love. I was the one who held the boundaries. They didn't like it, but they respected it because they had no other choice. My life in the countryside continued to flourish. I started a small garden, growing the rosemary and herbs I had always loved. I spent my weekends walking in the woods or visiting with the friends I had made at the hospital. Abigail became a regular visitor. She was a bright, thoughtful young woman who was pursuing a degree in social work. We often sat on my porch, talking about the things that really mattered: integrity, service, and the quiet strength of the human spirit. She told me once that standing up for me at the gala was the moment she finally grew up. I realized that day that being part of a good family doesn't mean anything if the people in it aren't good, she said. I couldn't have agreed more. As I sit here today, looking back on that Christmas so many years ago, I don't feel any bitterness. That rejection was the greatest gift my family ever gave me. It was the catalyst that forced me to see the truth and to finally choose myself. I spent so much of my life trying to earn a seat at a table where I wasn't wanted, only to realize that I could build a much better table of my own. I am Eleanor. I am a doctor, and I am a woman who knows her own worth. My life is full, not because of the status I have or the money I make, but because of the truth I live every single day. To anyone listening to my story who has ever been told they are too much, too serious, or too difficult, remember this. You are not the problem. You do not have to shrink yourself to fit into someone else's narrow world. Write your own story with the pride of someone who knows their value. My family had to learn to walk without my support, and I had to learn to love myself without their permission. It was a tough lesson, but the best one of my life. Thank you for being here with me and for listening to this personal part of my journey. If my story touched you, or if you faced a similar struggle, please leave a like on this video and subscribe to this channel for more stories of life and justice. Share this with someone who might feel invisible right now. Knowing you're not alone is the start of finding your own voice. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching from today? Have you ever had to close a door to save your own dignity? Thank you again for listening until the end. I wish you truth, peace, and the strength to be exactly who you are. The sun is fully set now, and it is time for me to go inside. My journey was long, but it led me home. I looked at my garden one last time before turning the door handle. The rosemary was strong and fragrant in the winter air. It reminded me of the stuffing I used to cook for them, a task I once thought was my burden, but now realized was just a skill I had. I will cook it for myself this year, and it will taste better than ever. This time, it won't be seasoned with a need for approval, but with the simple joy of a life that is truly mine. I stepped inside and locked the door. I was home,